7 actors made Steve Martin's dislike list, the white-haired comedian with a grin fans could never forget. For over 50 years, Martin has captivated audiences through his mix of clever wordplay and slapstick brilliance. From The Jerk to Father of the Bride, his roles shaped the course of American comedy for generations to come. Yet hidden beneath that friendly grin and calm demeanor lurks a side most admirers never imagine. A perfectionist demanding the highest standards and unwilling to tolerate mediocrity. To start things off, here's the first juggling ball. Though Martin is celebrated as one of Hollywood's most polished and polite figures, unearthed accounts from colleagues and directors paint a very different picture behind closed doors. Away from flashing bulbs and red carpets, Martin supposedly kept a private blacklist of co-stars he couldn't stomach, at times even refusing to work with them ever again. Number 2 is about to land. What could push such a master of comedy to openly feud with fellow actors? And how did these behind-the-scenes battles stay secret for so long? In this story, we'll expose the hidden clashes between America's comedy sweetheart and the 7 stars who provoked his quiet fury in ways audiences never suspected. The truth finally surfaces now. Stick around because the authentic Steve Martin may shock you as deeply as his movie personas have amused you all these decades. This is the version of Hollywood's gentle genius that the industry rarely acknowledges. The discussion begins right here. And yes, someone suggested wearing the Amigo suits again. But no, that idea was quickly dismissed as desperate and hollow. Take Chevy Chase as an example, when egos collided during the making of Three Amigos. On the screen, the trio of Martin, Chase, and Martin Short delivered a goofy masterpiece that fans still treasure, quoting lines like "My Little Buttercup" and "a plethora of piñatas" year after year. Off-screen, however, the Martin-Chase dynamic was riddled with friction. At the height of both men's stardom, they embodied opposite schools of humor. Martin, once a philosophy student obsessed with structured stand-up, approached comedy with surgical precision. Every beat, gesture, and silence was meticulously rehearsed to land exactly right. For him, laughter was an art form, not a gamble. Chase, in contrast, built his fame at Saturday Night Live through improvisation and spur-of-the-moment antics. A born troublemaker, he thrived on chaos, the very thing Martin despised. It was like throwing gasoline on ice, remembered director John Landis, who worked with both at the time. Steve would arrive with every second planned, only for Chevy to improvise wildly. You could watch Martin's frustration mounting by the second. Things finally erupted during a complicated scene combining movement and dialogue. After 7 takes ruined by Chevy's improvising, Martin supposedly told Landis in private, "He sticks to the script or I leave." Although tempers cooled enough to finish the film, the resentment stayed alive on set. Years later, while accepting a comedy award, Martin made what many interpreted as a thinly disguised jab. If ego were money, Chevy could buy the entire stock market. Audiences laughed, but insiders recognized the sting behind the joke. What makes their feud so fascinating is that both comedians were riding career highs at the time. Chase had just cemented himself with hits like Fletch and National Lampoon's Vacation, while Martin was fresh off successes such as All of Me and Roxanne. 2 giants of comedy with clashing styles, forced to collaborate in the same spotlight and barely holding it together. Although they've since shown polite professionalism in public, those who worked behind the camera on Three Amigos recalled the set as a constant duel between 2 comedic visions that were destined to collide. As one comedy insider summarized, they were both masters, just speaking entirely different comedic dialects. "I can't just settle into comfort," one writer remarked. That tension played out again with another comic heavyweight, Bill Murray, in the Saturday Night Live confrontation that froze a friendship. Before Bill became the elusive icon we know, he was a rising SNL star, brilliant but notoriously difficult. At the same time, Steve Martin was already an adored guest host, famous for characters like the wild and crazy guy. Their faithful clash happened during a 1978 episode when the two were slated to share a sketch. Those who witnessed it recall a backstage disaster that set off a decade of silence between them. Murray's late arrival to rehearsal instantly rattled Martin, a man who treated punctuality as respect. When Bill finally appeared, he seemed uninterested in preparation. As airtime loomed, the tension between them grew heavier by the minute. Martin had carefully rehearsed every beat, but Murray wandered into improvisation. On live television, Bill's ad-libs derailed Steve's timing and even mocked his delivery by imitating his voice. To the home audience, it may have looked like comedy, but to those behind the curtain, it was sabotage in plain sight. A stage manager later said Martin's face looked as if someone had torched his script mid-performance. After the cameras cut, Martin reportedly confronted Bill, reminding him that comedy is a partnership, not a hijacking. Murray laughed it off, suggesting Martin lighten up. What followed was a quiet estrangement that stretched over years. Neither man spoke of it in interviews, but both sidestepped working together again. More than a decade passed before they stood on the same stage, and even then, witnesses noticed an icy undertone. "Steve valued rehearsal and polish," said Lorne Michaels later, while Bill thrived on chaos and disruption. Sometimes brilliance in comedy doesn't align, and the result is what-ifs instead of classics. And then came Steve Carell, with tension brewing on the set of The Big Year. On paper, Martin and Carell seemed destined to mesh, both built on awkward yet good-hearted characters, both intellectual in their humor. But things were not quite as harmonious as expected. Both men had reputations for discipline and commitment to their craft. Yet while shooting 2011's The Big Year, a quirky comedy about birding competitions with Jack Black, friction bubbled up between the veteran comics. Their shared screen presence looked smooth enough, but reports from the set painted a much different picture. Problems allegedly surfaced early in the table reads, where Carell, sharpened by years of improvisation on The Office, often pitched alternate jokes in scene variations. Martin, however, arrived with his dialogue memorized, his character meticulously dissected, and his performance fully structured in advance, according to one production insider. When Carell began riffing with spontaneous lines, Martin's carefully charted plan was disrupted. To a perfectionist like Martin, who treats comedy as a finely tuned craft, Carell's free-form method felt like chaos instead of inspiration. At one point, he reportedly pulled the director aside and remarked, "Are we here to interpret the script or rewrite it? Because I showed up prepared for the former." The situation never escalated into a shouting match. Both stars were too seasoned to let it turn ugly. Still, the crew noticed Martin and Carell rarely mingled off camera, despite Jack Black's efforts to unite the cast during downtime. Later, as press tours began, keen-eyed fans saw that Martin and Carell were seldom interviewed together. Instead, the studio leaned on pairing Martin with Black for publicity. The clearest signal came after The Big Year wrapped. Though both men stayed busy in Hollywood, Martin and Carell never shared a project again. Even when Martin gathered ensembles for later films or for his ongoing partnership with Martin Short, Carell's name was never on the list. "It wasn't outright hostility," explained one director familiar with both. "It was a clash of creative languages. To Martin, improv implies the script is lacking. To Carell, improv is the path to finding unexpected brilliance. The difference shows how even minor philosophical riffs can create lasting divides among actors who've grown secure in their artistic methods. Martin once admitted in an interview that the hardest challenge in collaboration is syncing with another comedian's rhythm. It's like trying to line up your pulse with someone else's. As we continue exploring Martin's toughest working relationships, a theme becomes evident. The conflicts are less about pride, but more about style. It always comes back to the foundation of comedy itself. Martin views humor as architecture, planned, deliberate, and precisely executed. Many of his colleagues, however, see comedy as organic, unpredictable, something alive in the moment. Which raises a question. Is one approach better, or is the very tension between control and chaos what sparks the best comedy? Early on, people assumed Martin was simply avoiding conflict. But in private, filmmakers claim he quietly kept a mental list of actors he'd never partner with again, and the reasons were sharper than expected. To borrow a silly line, Mama said alligators have teeth but no toothbrush. Enter Adam Sandler, the generational comedy divide. They symbolize two very different eras in American humor. Martin, the cerebral absurdist who elevated comedy into art in the 70s and 80s, versus Sandler, who built a commercial juggernaut on man-child antics and juvenile gags starting in the 90s. Although they never teamed up on screen, their contrasting philosophies speak volumes about Martin's values. Emerging from the counterculture comedy scene of the late 60s, Martin forged a style that embraced absurdity while winking at it. Beneath his silliness ran philosophical depth. He even studied philosophy in college, inviting audiences to revel in irony, clever wordplay, and unexpected twists. Even in slapstick moments, there was structure holding it together. Sandler, by contrast, leaned on characters stuck in arrested development, fueled by gross-out jokes, tantrums, and childish antics. His box office dominance reflected everything Martin tried to move comedy past. In 2003, Martin told The New Yorker that he loved wit, but considered much slapstick just noise in a wig, a remark widely taken as a jab at Sandler's brand of humor. Insiders cite further evidence when both actors were floated for the same film in the early 2000s. Once Sandler's name came up, Martin allegedly quipped, "We're making different kinds of movies," and the idea was dropped immediately. The gulf between them mirrors a broader split in American comedy itself. On one side is sophistication, on the other, simplicity. On one side, nuance, on the other, blunt force. Neither style is inherently superior, but to Martin, Sandler's crude antics felt like regression for an art form he spent decades refining. As one of Martin's longtime friends put it, for Steve, comedy can be as elevated as any art. When it stoops to cheap laughs, he sees wasted potential. That divide explains why, despite overlapping networks of directors and studios, they never joined forces. They may both hold legendary status, but their comedic universes hardly overlap. And Martin, for his part, has always made it clear which kind of comedy he thinks will stand the test of time. Joe Piscopo, an unexpected source of friction on SNL that nearly disrupted a legacy. Hidden among Steve Martin's lesser-known comedy feuds was his strong dislike for Joe Piscopo, who became part of Saturday Night Live during what's often called the show's weakest stretch in the early 1980s. This clash reveals not just Martin's sharp comedic standards, but also his deep loyalty to the platform that first elevated him. Steve Martin's bond with Saturday Night Live ran deep, as he returned multiple times to host during its golden age before creator Lorne Michaels stepped away in 1980. With Michaels gone, the show stumbled into its so-called lost years under producer Gene Domanian, introducing a fresh cast that included Piscopo and Eddie Murphy. Although Murphy's career exploded into superstardom, Piscopo came to symbolize the creative decline of that particular SNL era. His exaggerated impressions and bodybuilder persona reflected a comedic style far removed from the sharper tone Martin had helped shape in earlier seasons. Writers from that time recall Steve being scheduled to host during the transition, but growing increasingly unsettled by rehearsals. What bothered him most, they said, was Piscopo's comedy, which struck Martin as heavy-handed and uninspired. One staffer even remembered Steve watching a rehearsal and visibly wincing. After seeing Piscopo's trademark Frank Sinatra impression, Martin reportedly turned to the head writer and asked, "This is what the show has become?" The situation escalated when Martin allegedly requested multiple Piscopo sketches be rewritten or cut entirely. While accounts vary, insiders confirm that Martin's distaste for Piscopo's material caused real turmoil backstage. Years later, the story resurfaced when Lorne Michaels returned to rebuild SNL's reputation. When asked about hosting in 1984, Martin supposedly replied, "Not with that guy," a clear reference to Piscopo. Coincidentally or not, Martin didn't step back onto the SNL stage until Piscopo had departed. This whole episode reflects Martin's larger philosophy about comedy. His devotion to the craft went beyond personal bias. For him, weak comedy wasn't harmless, it was an insult to the art form itself. His resistance to Piscopo came less from dislike than from artistic rejection of what he felt was lowering the show's standards. A longtime friend of Martin's explained it best. Steve expected SNL to keep pushing comedy ahead, not dragging it backward. Watching the show embrace what he considered lazy jokes felt like seeing an old friend lose their way. That disappointment stuck with him. Though Piscopo is now a minor footnote in comedy history, Martin's response to him shows how seriously he took his own principles, even when that meant creating tension behind the curtain. Which brings us to another storm, Eddie Murphy, the superstar Showdown. At the start of the 1980s, while Steve Martin's film career soared with The Jerk and Pennies in Heaven, a new powerhouse emerged on the very stage that once propelled Martin. That rising star was Eddie Murphy, youthful, fearless, and offering a voice that connected to a different generation. He embodied both the next chapter of comedy and a dramatic contrast to Martin's refined approach. Publicly, Martin acknowledged Murphy's brilliance, but offstage, their dynamic was far more complicated. Insiders suggest Martin repeatedly turned down projects with Murphy throughout the 1990s, despite the box office promise such a pairing would bring. A producer who knew both comedians admitted Martin admired Murphy's raw talent, yet criticized his tendency to rely on crude gags and profanity instead of sharper wit. Their comedy ideals simply didn't align. The feeling was not one-sided either. Promoting Beverly Hills Cop in 1984, Murphy remarked that some comedians looked down on street-style humor, claiming he represented real people rather than intellectual acts about being wild and crazy. The jab was widely interpreted as aimed at Martin's style. Tensions boiled over in the early 1990s when Paramount explored casting both stars in a major comedy project. Despite the studio's excitement, negotiations collapsed because neither man wanted to share the screen. As one executive summed it up, Steve thought Eddie was crass and over Hollywood, while Eddie saw Steve as irrelevant to younger fans. From a distance, both views carried truth, which is precisely why the partnership never happened. The clash highlighted a passing of the torch in American comedy, Martin's absurdist, cerebral tone giving way to Eddie's sharper, streetwise punch. Neither was mistaken, they simply represented different eras of humor. Ironically, both later reinvented themselves beyond their early trademarks, Martin moving into more reflective and dramatic roles, Murphy proving his versatility well beyond raw stand-up. Had they collaborated later, perhaps they would have found the common ground that eluded them in their primes. Instead, the Martin-Murphy rift remains a fascinating what-if in Hollywood history. A comedy dream duo undone not by lack of talent, but by philosophies too far apart to reconcile. And that leaves their near miss as one of the great unanswered questions in the world of comedy.